Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to Dorset Humanists, especially if this is your first time. I don't know if it is anyone's first time, but a very warm welcome this evening. In the unlikely event of an emergency, the main way out of here is the door at the back of the hall. If there's any problem there is a very interesting stairway up to the car park here as well, if we need that. Toilets are in the corridor if you need the toilet any time. The meeting will end, well, it normally ends at 9:15. It rather depends how we go, because we've got a lot to pack in tonight. 2 speakers, I'm sure there'll be lots of discussion. So I might decide to extend it to 9:30. So that's just a warning. But if you need to go at 9:15, then of course feel free to do so. Well, one of our speakers this evening is well known to Dorset Humanists. He's given us some fantastic talks. One on the contradictory nativity stories about Jesus, and if you're interested in that topic, he's got his book here on that subject. Another on arguments for and against the existence of God, and yet another one on free will. And again, he's written a book on free will, and you can come and have a look at that book if you are interested. And I think it's probably true to say that, is it true to say you still don't believe in free will? Is that, we don't want to get into that subject now, but anyway. Okay, right, we'll leave that one. He's a blogger. He is a tippling philosopher, whatever that is. He's written several books about religious and philosophical matters. He's also been on the telly. You may have seen him on the Big Questions on Sunday morning. In January, he blogged about Islam, and that's why we're here tonight. Our other speaker is me. And some years ago I gave a talk to Dorset Humanists on the origins of the Qur'an, but I expect you're all too young to remember that particular occasion. It was many years ago. I'm also chair of Dorset Humanists, in case you don't know, and neither Jonathan nor I are Muslims, as far as I know, but I think it's fair to say that we are both students of religion and have a great interest in religious matters. So I think you're going to have an informative evening, and we'll leave here with a greater understanding of Islam, and that's our main aim this evening. So would you please give a warm welcome to both of our speakers. So Jonathan Pearce is going to go first, so I will, without further ado, I will hand over to Jonathan, and I'm timing him about half an hour. Jonathan.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me all right? Okay, so I'm a liberal philosopher, and as David said, I wrote a piece on Islam, and was quite interested at the reactions I got to that, which were quite varied. And there was a number of fellow liberals who criticised me for what I said. I thought that's a really interesting idea, that here I am seeking truth, I'm seeking an appraisal of reality, and this is what I think, and I'm being attacked for attacking Islam. And I've never been attacked. I've spent years attacking Christianity, and some of those same people were absolutely fine with that. That's fair game. As soon as Islam is attacked from fellow lefties like myself, it's seen as a little bit off target, and I wonder why that is. Is it a case that that the left are generally against imperialist America, and therefore imperialist America is against Islam, and the enemy of your enemy is your friend? Is there some really interesting dynamic going on there? But anyway, so I thought it'd be interesting to look into this idea of whether Islam, and really tonight isn't so much as understanding Islam as a whole, that's too big a thing to do, but it's understanding the present religious violence in the context of Islam, and does it have anything to do with the content of that religion? So Islam and Christianity are two pillars of world religion. What separates them? Because they're very different. And the way that they deal with, or the way that we look at it in terms of epistemology, which is the study of knowledge in philosophy, is quite different. So Christianity has survived so well because in evolutionary terms it's really, really adaptive. There are 42,000 different denominations of Christianity, okay? And it has, as society has progressed over time, Christianity has adapted to society. So Christianity has adapted to moral progress, to technological progress, to scientific progress, and to economic progress. And part of that is because the book, the holy book that it's centred on, is the inspired word of God. We don't know who wrote it, we don't know when they wrote it, we don't know where they wrote it, and we can have pretty good guesses at all those and pretty good guesses about why they wrote it, but it's not the word of God. The core difference here is that Islam is based on the Qur'an, and the Qur'an is the direct word of God through the angel Gabriel to Muhammad. So here we have something which has less ability, there's less ability to interpret those words like you can the Bible, which you can cherry pick to fit your own. If you love money, there's a Christianity for you. If you hate money, capitalism, socialism. If you love slavery, there's Christianity for you. If you hate slavery, if you love gays, if you hate gays, if you love black people, if you hate black people, you can find that in the Bible. Whatever conclusion you want to draw, you can get from that. The Qur'an is slightly different, and it sits there and expects, or Islam sits there and expects society to adapt to it to some larger degree than Christianity. And that underpins the differences and why I think there is more of an issue with Islam seen in that evolutionary context. So the problem is there are myriad different Muslims in the world today: tolerant, liberal, moderate, extremist. Okay, who best represents Islam? Because on the one hand, we say, well, these jihadis who are causing such trouble in the Middle East and elsewhere are using violent religious extremism, and they are claiming it's in the name of Islam. On the other hand, we have peace-loving Muslims, the majority indeed, who are also claiming to be, real and proper Muslims. And in philosophy, this is called the no true Scotsman fallacy, which is to say, someone stands up and says, I'm a Scotsman, would you like porridge? Yes. Do you like salt in your porridge? No. Well, you're not a true Scotsman, sit down. And there's this idea of who actually decides who represents a true Scotsman. So that's a bit of a fallacious approach. But we have this with Islam. Who best represents Islam, and who gets to decide that? And my argument tonight will be that the basis of that comes from the Qur'an and from the role model of Muhammad himself. And therefore, you might not get a true Muslim, but you can get a truer sense of what a proper Muslim might be. So you hear these quotes. These are 3 quotes in recent years from heads of state around the world. This isn't the real Islam. This has nothing to do with Islam. Islam is a religion of peace. They are not Muslims. They are monsters. And of course, the jihadis would certainly disagree with that. I've got one admission. There are 2 very long quotes I am going to read in their entirety tonight. Apologies for that. Tough. I will come on to that in a second. So that's not to say that politics and other causal factors aren't important in what drives a religious extremist to violence. We are very happy to say that socio-economic degradation, poverty, lack of equality, all these things, alienation, can cause people to go towards religious violence. But it's interesting that when you say, well, the content of the Qur'an also drives that, people go, oh, no. Hang on, how can you say these other causal factors are responsible, and yet you draw this arbitrary line that doesn't allow the Qur'an to be held in any way responsible, or to have content which can be used to justify such atrocities? And that, to me, is a problem. Here is a quote about Ibn Warwick, who is an ex-Muslim critic of Islam. He says, "We are forever being told by apologists for Islam that it is essentially a religion of peace and love. Like all religions, and that anyone using violence in its name are not true or real Muslims. That this apologia will not wash is made plain by Ibn Warwick in his discussion of the Muslim exegetical technique of Nasq." That means the technique of analysing the Quran, or abrogation, whereby, according to the traditional chronology of events, early texts or revelations are overruled by later ones. By laying them out in detail, Ibn Warwick shows that the majority of texts recommending clemency and tolerance are abrogated by later ones advocating violent action. It seems that terrorists have as much right to consider themselves good Muslims as any others. And that's really the core of what I've been talking about. So, basically, Islam can be split, from my point of view, into broadly three parts. Muhammad, the Qur'an, and the adherents today, Muslims today, and their actions. So we start with Muhammad. He was involved in 65 military campaigns. He ruled by the sword. He nicknamed his swords things like pluck out death, and was himself called the obliterator. So, you start getting a sense of Muhammad as a person, as a militaristic ruler. In the Battle of Trench, it decapitated 600 to 900 men and boys, I think one woman. So when you're looking at the atrocities around the world at the moment, is there some kind of reflection in the role model of Muhammad, who was a divine prophet? He enslaved women and children. This all sounds familiar. Now, it's interesting when you compare Muhammad, who was I've given you information on the sheet. I simply don't have time to go through that. But if you want to learn a little bit about how the Quran was written, it's on there. But if you compare Muhammad to Jesus, Jesus was a turn the other cheek, love thy neighbour socialist. Okay, he was all about forgiveness and a lot more tolerance, I think, because he wasn't a military leader. He was a socialist revolutionary. Muhammad is a totally different kettle of fish. Muhammad was a military leader who had to fight to get Islam on the map. And as a result, his actions were pretty brutal. And if you are going to look, and the Qur'an came out of him. The Qur'an was a series of revelations over 22 years from a cave, or broadly speaking, from God. So he had these revelations. Now, to the humanists and the atheists like ourselves, this looks like post hoc rationalisation, which is to say, rationalising after the event. I'm going to go and attack this caravan and kill these people. Oh, I've had a revelation that seems to condone that. How convenient. So there is a sense that the revelations can possibly be seen to the cynic to follow, to kind of justify the actions of Muhammad himself in forcing through his worldview. So it's a very, very different kettle of fish. So my first point, very quickly, is to say that if you're looking to the kind of leader of your religion or the role model of your religion, Muhammad is a militaristic, brutal leader that killed many, many people and came up with lots of rules, supposedly through God, to that had negative impacts on large amounts of the population. So the second pillar, if you like, not to be confused with the 5 pillars of Islam, second pillar of my approach to Islam is the Qur'an. And I don't know, it'd be interesting, how many people here have read the Qur'an? Okay, a handful, 4 people. Yeah.
That's right.
So, yes, and that's a really important word because it is so dry. I do apologise to Muslims who hold it very dear, but it is really quite a dry book, and it's very, very repetitive. And it's quite incredible. I went through the second book, actually, the second chapter, Surah Al-Baqarah, the cow, the heifer, and I highlighted all the bits that had a go at disbelievers and unbelievers and polytheists, and it was about 50-50. So in other words, that chapter, the longest chapter in the Quran, dealt as much with non-believers as it did with believers, and that is a recurrent theme throughout. In fact, I came away from reading the Quran feeling dehumanised, which is a really powerful word amongst humanists. I actually felt dehumanised. I felt like I was less. I felt not human, not worthy. The contempt and scorn poured on the reader or unbelievers in the Quran is quite incredible. Now, this is really interesting because then if I put myself in the shoes of a Muslim reading that, how can you have social cohesion when you've got a book that is consistently telling you scornfully about non-believers? And in fact, there's one such quote from the Quran is here, which is to say, "Thou will not find any people who believe in Allah and the last day, loving those who resist Allah and His Messenger, even though they were their fathers or their sons or their brothers or their kindred." That's to say, if you're an unbeliever, you cannot be friends. A Muslim cannot be friends with a non-Muslim. So you get these. You can't just ignore claims like this or try and cherry pick this is the immutable word of God. And there's another claim here that says, "No change can there be in the words of Allah. This is indeed the supreme success." So you can't change Allah's words. You can't just that was then, this is now. as much as 20% of the Qur'an is thought to be, concentrating on unbelievers like ourselves. So you do have contradictions in the Qur'an. Now, how can you have contradictions? Because it's the immutable word of God. Now, that doesn't change. So what goes on? Well, actually, within the Qur'an and these other texts called the Hadith, which are written after the Qur'an, talk about this thing called nasq, or abrogation, which is this technique of, if there's a contradiction, then the chronologically later text supersedes the earlier one. Now, it's really important to know a little bit of the history of Muhammad here. So Muhammad set up his preaching in Mecca. He was from Mecca. There was a lot of polytheism, there was a lot of inequality and social injustice. And he set up this, and to get attention and to get followers, he went through the love and peace kind of tack. Now, that was all good and well. He got some followers, kept it close to himself, and then ended up going elsewhere to sort out the dispute elsewhere, and then started growing more and more in popularity. And he moved to Medina, and while he's in Medina and continued having revelations, he basically became more militaristic. And these verses that came out of Medina were the later verses. So the theory of abrogation means that if you've got a contradiction between love and hate, or love and war, actually the war abrogates the love. So there's a real movement towards militarism and expansionism as he sought to destroy caravans, to have a go at the polytheists in Mecca, and eventually he took over Mecca, and there's this place, the Kaaba, which is full of idols, a bit like if you've seen in the Middle East recently with the destroying of museums and stuff. That's what they did. When you say that's disgusting that the jihadis are doing that, that was one of the core winning moves of Muhammad. He went and destroyed all the idols in Mecca. So he moved towards a more militaristic approach. And the Quran is absolutely littered with such verses about death and destruction, and generally Jews and non-believers and polytheists getting the rough end of the stick. So it's really hard to justify a loving approach to a pluralist society. We're a pluralist society. That means there's a plurality of beliefs. Yeah? And most people in the world are not Muslims, which means that in order to make most people Muslims, I don't know, where do you take your ideas from of how to do that? The Quran and Muhammad. You are invariably going to move towards, I would argue, a more militaristic approach. And as his power base grew, the revelations that he had of violence grew. So I'm going to read you a big quote here, and this is about contextualising. So with the Bible, you historically contextualise. Why can't you do that? Well, the Old Testament is not relevant anymore because the New Testament's overtaken the Old Testament, and this and that, and it was only relevant for the time it was in. Why can't we do that with Islam and the Quran? Well, as I said, it's the immutable word of God that just sticks. You can't cherry pick it. You can't say, I've seen, Dean will know, William Lane Craig, a very famous Christian debater. If he's cornered on the Old Testament and some of the horrors in the Old Testament, he says the first thing as a believer you can do is drop the infallibility of the Old Testament. He doesn't admit to doing that, but he says you can do that. That's a choice you have. You have the choice of saying, well, actually, the Bible is just wrong. It's written by humans, inspired by God, but they just got it wrong. And in fact, there are empirically lots of mistakes in the Bible of flat-out contradictions. So it literally cannot be all totally correct. Can you do this with Islam and the Quran? Well, I'm going to read this to apologise. There's always the applied to context argument with Islam's holy text, Quran. The apologetic version is Quran cannot be interpreted and understood except with its context. This paraphrasing is constantly adduced by Islamic apologists whenever any argument against the violent verses within the text is raised. Is it not implausible to believe in the infinite relevance of the Quran and at the same time raise objections to critiques by embarking a context smokescreen? Should not Muslims give up the context excuse if they want to use Quran as a text which is relevance is distended to the end of times? There's only an affirmative answer to these questions. Gone the wrong way. Oh, that's the wrong button. Let us come back to the Quran. Allah spoke to a 7th century Arab in the latter's language, and all what he said to this prophet is recorded to fructify Quran. To sum it up, Allah sent his last message to this same prophet then stop speaking downright, because God sent his last message and promised to preserve it forever. He will not speak any more until the day of resurrection. He will not send any prophet, since sending a prophet will stir him up again. This is the end. God sent his final messenger, and even though he did not favour immortality to the messenger, he blessed the message with immortality. So Qur'an, Islam's holy text, is not a pushover. It's the ultimate message of God. There is nothing to add or subtract in it. All of its components are divine, equally divine. All are applied to all and all. In conclusion, if there is a command in Qur'an, there is no need to look for its historical context, since humanity, from the formation of Qur'an to the end of times, are living in the context of the text. It is a Muslim belief. God, Gabriel, Muhammad, three key figures formed Qur'an, have infinite relevance, so the making too necessarily possess the quality of being interminably relevant. If this is the common Muslim belief pertaining to Qur'an, there is no room for a context excuse in its case. Thus, the context excuse in the case of Qur'an is flawed in its fundamentals. So a long quote, I do apologise, but the point is big. You can't contextualise the Qur'an. So what does this say about reform? We don't want to reform the Qur'an in the same way that there's a Protestant Reformation. Okay, so that was a bit of John Calvin. You know, we don't want to see that happen to it. Is that we just want a liberal Reformation where the religion takes on our progressive moral values. But if you remove the Qur'an, you start messing with the Qur'an, there is no Islam, it falls apart. So we're left with this real problematic issue. And that leads me to the third and final pillar, are the Muslims and their actions. They are the greatest hope for a kind of reformation. There is a difference between Muslim countries, but are there more correct Muslim countries? Are there more correct Muslim countries from a liberal progressive perspective and from an Islamic perspective? You know, radicalists, are they not true Muslims in the same way liberals claim to be? So the Quran plus Muhammad equals radicalists closer to the truth, is my opinion. Now, you can see peaceful verses in the Quran, but there are just as many, if not more, violent and powerfully destructive verses as well. And, you know, as humanists, we say they're all wrong. But if you are a Muslim, then that's what you've got to go by, the Quran and Muhammad. And I just suggest you, if you're in any doubt, read the Quran and have a look into Muhammad's life. So politics and other factors do cause extremism as well, but the Quran and Muhammad are vital components. One last big quote, and then I'm done, I promise. So, most Muslims are, like most other people, essentially decent, kind, and appalled at terrorist violence. Yet within Islam is another powerful sentiment, often coexisting with the kindness. A Pew Research study shows that most Egyptian Muslims, a whopping 88%, think that death is the appropriate penalty for leaving Islam. In Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Pakistan, and Palestinian territories, it's the same sort of case. In Turkey, a much more secular, more conservative country, a solid majority opposes the death penalty for apostates. But there's 17% of Muslims who favour it. In Islam, leaving the faith isn't simple apostasy as Westerners see it, but a form of treason against a larger community. So they see it as appropriate to kill people for such things. The analysis of these numbers is tricky, but they underline an important point. The beliefs and attitudes that promote violence against non-Muslims for offences against Islam are held by a minority of Muslims, but it's not a small minority in terms of absolute numbers. It's probably in the high tens or low hundreds of millions. Okay? That's a lot of problem. But does extreme lose its meaning when nearly half a given population holds the position being described? I'm honestly not quite sure what to make of all this data, and I'm reluctant to land any sort of definitive conclusion pertaining to the internal struggle on these subjects. Again, I don't want to fall into the trap of unfairly painting with too broad a brush, nor am I interested in doing the opposite by blithely ignoring data like this, or worse, attacking those who mention it as bigots. Which brings me to question number 2. How can anyone fairly examine any of this data and then loudly declare that Islamism's worst excesses have nothing to do with Islam itself? It's one thing to argue over whether the tiny fraction narrative is accurate or whether it does more harm than good. It's a dangerous brand of delusion, however, to pretend that Islamist extremism, there's that word again, is entirely divorced from Islam. Many millions of people represented in the statistics above obviously identify as practicing faithful Muslims. Shouldn't that be enough for us, especially based on the left's own standards? And finally, those who insist that Islamist terrorists aren't real Muslims, the approved sensitive position du jour, ought not be offended by this admittedly ugly suggestion. This is quite interesting as a thought experiment. Not real Muslims equals no need to treat them as such, right? Shouldn't these same people agree that, say, Guantanamo Bay guards could all deny Al-Qaeda detainees access to the Qur'an and special halal diets without violating their human rights? After all, they're violent extremists, they're not real Muslims. Well, who gets to decide that? How do the new true Muslim rules work? I'll close by again conceding that I don't know what the appropriate balance should be when it comes to criticising large elements within Islam. I'm confident, however, that evading the questions I've raised by way of self-righteous preening, I'm saying these things regardless of the facts because I want everyone to know that I'm a compassionate, non-judgmental person, does this important discussion a tremendous disservice and literally endanger lives. And basically that's where I'm going to leave it, is that if you close Islam off from being able to be criticised, I think that's a dangerous game. But on the flip side is, what do we do? If we accept that Islam can't really exist without its extremely violent and socio-political militaristic roots, then where does that leave us with a modern society that looks to a pluralist, humanist future? I don't have an answer to that, and be interested to hear what you have to say, and certainly what David has to say. But I'm the depressing one here. Sorry guys, I think Islam is really quite problematic, and I'm fairly sure that comes from the core tenets of the Qur'an plus Muhammad. Sorry about that. Thanks for listening, and sorry about the long quotes.
Yeah, you've got another 5 minutes.
Another 5 minutes.
But we've got plenty of time for discussion. Thank you very much, Jonathan. And yes, I was just congratulating Jonathan on sticking well within time, so it gives us a little bit more time for questions. Okay, my technical man is just sorting out my slides.
We need to log into your...
Oh, okay, I need to log in.
Oh yeah, you see that.
Okay, great. I've got gadget. Oh.
Extend the screen.
Yeah, you need to function. Yeah, there you go.
Excellent, thank you very much, Dave. Well, my presentation is a response to Jonathan's blog, which was entitled True Islam and Violent Extremism. And I'm relieved to discover this evening that his presentation tonight is not a million miles away from what you wrote in January. So I think we're sort of addressing the same questions. Okay, so the questions that Jonathan addressed in this blog. Am I standing in the way of the screen of anyone? Or can everyone... I am standing in the way of it, okay.
Okay.
Just move these round a bit, sorry Dave. That's fine. Is that okay? Is that alright for you, Chris?
Just about.
Just about, okay, well done. So, the questions that Jonathan addressed. Does Islam as a religion have causal responsibility for Islamic terrorism? Who is a real Muslim, and what is the current state of Islam today? Do radicals and jihadis have a more fundamentally accurate picture of Islam than liberal and moderate Muslims, and why has Islam not gone through the sort of theological reformation that Christianity has? Well, Jonathan takes exception to the typical statements that get trotted out after every Islamist atrocity. I'm sure you're familiar with them, and Jonathan mentioned them this evening. This isn't the real Islam. This has nothing to do with Islam. Islam is a religion of peace. They're not Muslim, they're monsters. I'm sure we've all heard this. Well, Jonathan considers, and has considered this evening, 3 elements of Islam in order to come to his conclusions. He looks at the text of the Qur'an itself, the life and character of Muhammad, and opinion polls of Islam. In conclusion, he wrote this: I posit that fundamentalist Muslims are more fundamentally correct in their faith. What Islam is supposed to be, I wager, is closer to the jihadi version. Liberal and moderate Muslims are contravening the important diktats of the Qur'an and do not appear to be following in the footsteps of Muhammad. Sharia law does seem to be a natural add-on from the scriptures, and most Muslims around the world appear to be in some sort of agreement with that. He also writes, we could adopt some sort of postmodernism, which states that they are all right in some sense, but there must be some sort of accurate representation of what Muhammad set out. Well, I took up Jonathan's challenge to read the Qur'an. It was part of my holiday reading in the Lake District, and my partner is getting more and more worried about my holiday reading. He's here tonight. And I have to agree with Jonathan, it was a pretty grim read from the point of view of unbelievers who will suffer all sorts of torments in the life hereafter. Now, the life of Muhammad is rather problematic. Jonathan this evening has said quite a bit about the biography of Muhammad. I think this is rather problematic because it's very difficult to know whether we have any reliable information about Muhammad. The first biography we have was written about 200 years after he died, which is a far worse position that we find ourselves in with the Christian Gospels, if indeed you think that the Christian Gospels contain any biographical information about Jesus. I did read A Modern Life of Muhammad by Tariq Ramadan. I like Ramadan's academic writings, but his book on Muhammad was frankly a work of hagiography. So here's my first question to the audience. Who knows what hagiography means? Anyone? Yes, at the back there.
Lives of the Saints.
Lives of the Saints, yeah, so it's a kind of idealised portrait of somebody. Not critical. So if you're not, however, it is clear that if we take the biography that we have of Muhammad at face value, it's clear that unlike Jesus, Muhammad had a private army, and undoubtedly he was involved in at least one brutal massacre, which Jonathan mentioned. But I don't think we have time tonight to get into any detailed discussion of his moral qualities as a religious leader, although that is part of Jonathan's argument. As for the views of Muslims around the world today, it is of course very difficult to know whether the vast majority are moderates or extremists, whether a sizable minority agree with the extremists. It very much depends on how you define these terms. I'm not sure that the true nature of Islam can be determined by opinion polls, but I agree it's an interesting topic for research and discussion. As a quick digression, I'd like to say something about the word Islamophobia, which has become almost unusable because it's so politicised. There may well be things in Islam of which we are fearful, but I'd like to suggest an alternative word which might be more useful. And the word I have in mind is extremophobia. Now, I thought I'd made this word up and I was going to write to the Oxford Dictionary and get my name into the history books of this word. But of course, as soon as I looked it up on the internet, there was plenty of instances of this word. So do remember this word, extremophobia, which means fear of extremism, in whatever form we find it. Then if we want to talk separately about unfair discrimination and hostility towards Muslims, we can simply talk about unfair discrimination and hostility without using ambiguous words. Well, moving on, I was tempted to argue that the whole debate about the true nature of Islam, like the true Scotsman, is rather misplaced. In philosophy, this kind of exercise is called essentialism, the idea that we can determine the true essence of something. Postmodernists claim that there is no such thing as the essential truth of something like a text. The best we can hope for is different readings and interpretations. But Jonathan wrote, there must be some sort of accurate representation of what Muhammad set out. Well, fair enough. I'm not saying that anything goes. But what I would say, and I think this is a fair representation of the state of Islam today, is that there is a battle going on for the soul of Islam. If we can reduce it to two sides, I think we've got extremists on one side and moderates on the other. And this is not just my view, this is how it's portrayed by this academic. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his name, so you might have to help me out, but let's go for Khalid Abu al-Fadl, or Fadl. Pardon? Fadl.
Should be Fadi.
Fadi. So you don't pronounce the L. Okay. I might just call him Khalid, actually. That's a bit easier. Professor of law at the University of California. He wrote a great book. If you want one book to read, this is a very readable book and it explains a lot. The Great Threat, Wrestling Islam from the Extremists, and he characterises Islam today as this kind of two sides, extremists versus moderates. Well, what are we to make of Jonathan's position that fundamentalist Muslims are more fundamentally correct in their faith? Liberal and moderate Muslims are contravening the important diktats of the Qur'an, Jonathan said in his blog. Well, I think the problem lies in Jonathan's phrase, the important diktats of the Qur'an. Because in this one phrase, Jonathan simply concedes the whole argument to the extremists and wipes out centuries of Islamic philosophy and jurisprudence. If you're not familiar with this word, jurisprudence, it means philosophy of law, if we have any lawyers in the audience. Islam is very similar to rabbinic Judaism in the sense that it is a law-based religion. It doesn't simply read off diktats from the text. What we have are trained jurists and different schools of law who spent centuries arguing over the text and issuing their rulings or fatwas. A fatwa is just a legal ruling or an opinion. In the first 2 centuries of Islam, there were over 30 different schools of law, and by the 10th century this number had been reduced down to just 4 main Sunni schools, but this still represents a significant degree of diversity, with the Hanbali school being the strictest. When we talk about Sharia law, what we're actually referring to in a physical sense is at least 50,000 volumes of legal rulings and a huge diversity of opinion. Strictly speaking, Sharia only exists in heaven, and Islamic jurisprudence is merely human striving towards the Sharia. Anyway, to cut a long story short, what's happened in Muslim-majority countries like Egypt over the last couple of centuries is a process of westernisation. In particular, Western law superseded Sharia law, and Islamic jurists and schools of law lost their funding and prestige. We might think of this as progress, westernisation, we might think that, but the unintended consequence of this is that it left a vacuum in religious authority in modern Islam. So unlike Catholicism, Islam has no pope, and so the situation we have today in terms of religious authority is actually one of chaos. Khalid calls it a state of anarchy. And so Jonathan may claim that he knows what the authentic Islam looks like, but in the Islamic world itself there's just a massive debate going on. Well, what I'd like to do in the little time we have is to take you on a very high-speed journey through Islamic history. You've got the handout as well, which you can look at your leisure afterwards. But this is just to give you some idea as to how aspects of Islamic pluralism and diversity have played out over the centuries. And we may even stumble across some surprising atheists and skeptics.
We'll be with you back in a second.
So one of the key aspects we'll be looking at is the place of critical reason in Islamic jurisprudence. And 2 of the key principles involved in legal interpretation of Sharia are, I thought this was pronounced taqlid, but apparently it's taglud, and ijtihad. So taglud means imitation or authority, and ijtihad means creative interpretation or using independent judgment. And this struggle between these 2 ways of approaching interpretation of Sharia goes right back to the very earliest times. So One of the earliest schools which tried to reconcile reason and revelation were called the Mutazilites, who flourished between the 8th and the 10th centuries in Basra and Baghdad. In response to some of the controversies of the time, their distinctive contribution was to take the middle position between two extremes. They were considered to be rationalists, and they believed that the Qur'an is created, not uncreated. In other words, it was created by human beings, just like the Bible. They were ultimately denounced as heretics, but Mutazilism continued to inspire later reformers. Obviously, I think they were right about the Qur'an being a human product in exactly the same way that the Book of Mormon is a human product. And sorry, this is a digression, but I couldn't resist this little digression about the similarities between Muhammad and Joseph Smith. So, Joseph Smith on the right, we don't have any images or photographs of Muhammad on the left there. Now, some similarities. They both received revelations whenever it suited their own purposes. Jonathan mentioned that. Muhammad received his revelations from the angel Gabriel. Joseph Smith received his revelations from the angel Moroni. Both of them enjoyed the privilege of multiple wives. They probably had similar personality profiles. They both had private armies at their disposal. The original Qur'an is written on a tablet in heaven, and the original Book of Mormon was written on golden plates, and so on and so on. Well, I'll leave you to ponder the comparisons and similarities between these two figures, but I thought they were rather interesting. You may also be interested to hear about a Persian freethinker called Ibn al-Rawandi. He started out as a Mutazilite and ended up as a complete skeptic and an atheist. Another Persian figure, al-Razi, 10th century, was the most famous and widely respected Islamic authority on medicine in the medieval world. He was a rationalist and an anti-religionist. Not surprisingly, he was condemned as a heretic and a blasphemer. A more conservative figure was al-Ash'ari, who was born in Basra and died in Baghdad. He's the founder of the Ash'arite school of theology. The Ash'arites were not opposed to reason, but they promoted a more conservative theology, which ultimately prevailed over the Mutazilites. We should also remember at this point that the Al-Azhar University in Cairo was one of the oldest universities in the world. Founded in 970, it predates Oxford by at least a century, and its students studied the Qur'an, Islamic law, along with logic, grammar and rhetoric. We should also mention that in the 10th and 11th centuries, Cordoba in Muslim Spain was one of the most advanced cities in the world. The city had 3,000 mosques, splendid palaces, 300 public baths, and the largest library in the world. Well worth a visit if you get a chance to go to Cordoba. Well, I think it's fair to say that most of us, including many Muslims, are pretty ignorant about the achievements of Islamic civilization and the contributions it made to science, philosophy, medicine, maths and astronomy. The clues are in the names of the things which have come down to us. Algorithms. I only found out at the weekend what an algorithm was, thanks to Simon at the back there. Thank you, Simon. Algebra, alkali, and ironically, even alcohol. The president of the British Humanist Association is called Jim Al-Khalili, and he's written a book celebrating the golden age of Arabic science, so you may want to follow up on that book. So when people talk about the clash of civilizations, they should remember that Islamic civilization predated the Renaissance and was one of the building blocks of what we now call Western civilization. Okay, coming into the 11th century, Ibn Sina, if you've studied philosophy, you will know him as Avicenna. He was a polymath who made contributions to medicine, maths and philosophy. He tried to reconcile reason and religion through allegorical interpretation. And one of my favourite figures from this period is Al-Mari, a blind poet who poured scorn on religion. He thought that kissing the black stone was superstitious nonsense. He was charged with blasphemy, but he escaped prosecution. So this is the Kaaba in Mecca, the cube-shaped shrine, and the black stone is set in the corner there, and it's believed to be a meteorite. So because this stone fell from heaven, the Muslims thought that it was from heaven. Okay, whilst we're about it, let's chuck in a gay poet from the 9th century. Abu Nuwas is considered a great lyric poet, and his twin passions were wine and beautiful boys. A poem attributed to him in the Perfumed Garden speaks of the joys of sodomy, but perhaps we'll draw a veil over that one this evening. So I'm going to share a different poem with you. Accumulate as many sins thou canst, the Lord is ready to relax his ire. When the day comes, forgiveness thou wilt find before a mighty king and gracious sire, and gnaw thy fingers all that joy regretting which thou didst leave through terror of hell fire. So in other words, sin as much as you like, because God is merciful, and when you get to the other side he will forgive you. So that was his take on the hereafter. In the 12th century we meet the hugely important figure of Al-Ghazali, who died in 1111, incredibly at 11 minutes past 11 o'clock on the 11th of November. I made up that last bit, sorry. Anything for a quick laugh. He's been referred to by some historians as the single most influential Muslim after Muhammad. Unfortunately, he attacked reason and philosophy in favour of revelation. His most famous book is The Incoherence of the Philosophers, so there's clues in the title. A rather more appealing figure to us in the 12th century was Ibn Rashid, known to us, if you've studied philosophy, as Averroes. He was one of the greatest commentators on Aristotle, and he believed in both reason and revelation. His counterblast to Al-Ghazali was the incoherence of the incoherence. Rather nice, I like that. Well, everything started to go wrong in 1258 with the Mongol invasions and the sack of Baghdad. The Ottoman Empire lasted from 1299 until 1924, but from the 16th century onwards, the opening of new sea routes to the Americas and South Asia bypassed the Muslim world. This led to colonial empires and the decline of Islamic civilization. So I'm going to fast forward now to the 18th and 19th centuries and introduce you to some more seminal figures, one fanatic and four liberals. So here's our fanatic. Abd al-Wahhab, the founder of Wahhabism, which is the Saudi school of puritanical Islam, also known as Salafism, from the word Salaf, which means ancestors. His aim was to purify Islam by returning Muslims to the original principles of their religion. His pact with Mohammed bin Saud helped to establish the first Saudi state. There's a kind of codependency between the rulers of Saudi Arabia and Wahhabism, which still continues today. And the Saudis have aggressively exported Wahhabism around the globe. And it's actually very difficult for any Muslim anywhere to dissent from Wahhabi doctrine, because if you do, the Saudi authorities can refuse your visa application to visit the holy sites of Mecca and Medina. Well, our first liberal in this period is Shah Wali Allah, is an Islamic scholar who emphasised the importance of reason and the principle of ijtihad, to remember is independent judgment or creative interpretation. And he said this: the time has come for the religious law of Islam to be brought into the open, fully dressed in reason and argument. And he was a major influence on later exponents of liberal Islam. Our second liberal is Al-Afghani. He was one of the founders of Islamic modernism. And he said this: if a man believes things without proof or reason and is satisfied to follow his ancestors, his mind inevitably desists from intellectual movement, and little by little stupidity and imbecility overcome him. Rather delicious quotation. Our third liberal, Muhammad Abduh, Egypt, a scholar and liberal reformer, also one of the founders of Islamic modernism. sometimes called Neo-Mutazilism after the Mutazilites. And by the early 20th century, liberals were in charge of the Al-Azhar University in Cairo, which became a focus for liberals to visit and study. Another leading modernist scholar was Al-Qasimi, Syrian. He referred to Taglud as a leprosy which has spread widely among the people, a general paralysis, a stupefying lunacy plunging man into apathy and indolence. Well, some people had high hopes for Islamic modernism in the 1920s, but after the end of the Ottoman Empire in 1924, modernism was eclipsed by nationalism, socialism and hardline revivalism, as represented in new organisations such as the Muslim Brotherhood, which was founded in Egypt by Hassan al-Banna. Its goal is to make the Qur'an and Sunnah the sole reference point for ordering the life of the Muslim family, individual, community and state. Its mottos include: Islam is the solution, Allah is our objective, the Qur'an is the constitution, the Prophet is our leader, jihad is our way, death for the sake of Allah is our wish. Another key organisation is Jamaat-e-Islami, which means Assembly of Islam, an Islamist political party founded by Maududi. Its objective is to make Pakistan an Islamic state governed by Sharia law. And I need to mention one more seminal figure on the Islamist front, Sayyid Qutb, a leading member of the Muslim Brotherhood. He wrote Milestones in 1964, which is an influential Islamist tract. This was another bit of my holiday reading. I don't recommend these books necessarily for relaxation. And this lays out a plan to recreate the Muslim world on strictly Quranic grounds. He was executed in 1966 for plotting to assassinate the Egyptian president. Abd al-Wahhab is a kind of Islamic version of John Calvin. Wahhabism is a fundamentalist, evangelical and violent creed or version of Islam. It disregards centuries of Islamic philosophy and goes back to the Qur'an and reads off whatever it wants to from the original texts. It's very similar to Christian fundamentalism, except that it's much more violent and extremist and intolerant. According to our scholar Khalid in the University of California, the original Wahhabis carried out 40,000 public executions and 350,000 amputations. The second question posed by Jonathan: do radicals and jihadis have a more fundamentally accurate picture of Islam than liberals and moderates? Well, as I said earlier, no one in the Muslim world can give a definitive answer to this question because no one is in charge of global Islam. It's a free-for-all. But in terms of how Islam has been understood for most of its history, the answer to this question is no. For most of its history, Islam has been pluralistic and tolerated a diversity of opinion. Al-Wahhab's own brother, Suleiman, thought that many of the beliefs and practices of Wahhabism were an aberration and a corruption of mainstream Islam. Khalid acknowledges that Wahhabism has become extremely influential throughout the Muslim world today because of its control of Mecca and Medina, but he maintains that the majority of Muslims are moderate, not extreme. Well, I think I've answered the third question now: who is a real Muslim? What's the current state of Islam today? So moving on to the fourth question: does Islam as a religion have causal responsibility for Islamic terrorism? Well, I think this places causality in the wrong place. I think the primary cause of Islamic terrorism, as with any form of terrorism, is the sense of powerlessness and alienation felt in a given community. Sociologically, Islamism is a predictable response to the identity crisis felt by many Muslims in the modern world, but of course it's not the only possible response, and I'm not seeking to excuse it in any way. The fact that the foundational texts of Islam can be mined for extremist views is secondary and incidental, because this is not the way that the Qur'an and Sunnah have traditionally been handled. Historically speaking, Islamist extremism is an aberration, and it's a catastrophe that it has become so powerful through the agency of the immensely rich Saudis. One of the solutions is, of course, to reduce our dependency on oil. So when you next get the chance, please say yes to the Navitas Bay wind farm. Well, I'd like to conclude with a couple of quotations from Tariq Ramadan and Khalid, which express some potential common ground between Muslims and humanists. Tariq Ramadan first. Many Christians, Jews, Buddhists, agnostics and atheists are inspired in their social and political commitments by their religious, humanist and ethical convictions. All human beings must seek to live and to nourish and give meaning to what constitutes their humanity. To express their values in order to achieve good, we have numerous values in common that invite us to enter into commitments side by side. And Khalid, I have become convinced that the Puritan or extremist end of the spectrum empties Islam of its moral and ethical content. I've become convinced that a non-humanistic Islam is a false Islam, that Islam is a message of compassion, mercy, love and beauty, and that these values represent the core of the faith. Well, Jonathan, I think if we insist that true Islam is extremist Islam, that makes us part of the problem. I know you are motivated by a disinterested search for truth, and I respect that, but looking at the whole history of Islam, I don't think you are completely wrong, but I think we can be more optimistic about the true nature of Islam, and I think as humanists, instead of being part of the problem, we can be part of the solution. Thank you, and Salam Alaikum. Okay, well, I don't know if Jonathan wants to come back at me or anything that I can't come back at him. We're going to have some questions from the floor as well. But perhaps, first of all, if there's anything you want to... If we have a bit of an exchange, and then we definitely will get to your questions. Okay?
I might have a couple of things. I think one of the key aspects to this is the battle for the soul that you talked about.
Yeah.
So the battle for the souls of Muslims. And what's actually going on is that the liberal and moderate Muslims are those who put the community, the moral community frameworks, or the moral frameworks that they hold first. So when you talked about westernised Muslims, what that actually means is Muslims who are happy enough to relegate the Qur'an and Islam to a secondary position. So their lives are not dictated by the Qur'an or by Quranic values, that certain Quranic values that they find. And with the extremists, what they do is they put the Qur'an first and the idea of Muhammad first. So really, this kind of plays into the truer type of Muslim being the radicalist, because they're literally they're living their life more strongly by the Quran and by Islam, and those moderates are relegating it past the progressive moral values that society has around them. What would you say to that?
Well, first of all, I think I'd say that it sounds as though you're an apologist for Wahhabism, which is a very nasty thing to say, but, anyway, I've said that. I won't say anything really any worse than that.
Well, actually, no, that's an interesting to interrupt, but...
Okay, go on.
When you have clear verses in the text which say you cannot be friends with non-Muslims, well, that's not Wahhabism. 100,000 Hindus were killed, I think, in 1199 or 1299 by under Timur. There were terrible atrocities. You've got to remember, Wahhabism also came with technological advances such that killing was easier, right? But in the olden times, you had swords to kill people. And still 100,000 people were killed in one particular instance, and atrocities took place throughout history. So I think the idea that Wahhabism is this suddenly Islam has turned violent in the last 100, 200 years, I think is a bit of a misnomer.
Okay.
won't interrupt
Part of my argument is that modern Islamism does go back to Abd al-Wahhab, but okay, we could look at earlier precedents for that, and I'm sure there are plenty. Well, when I read people like Tariq Ramadan, I don't know if any of you have read his books. I mean, they are quite heavy-going, quite academic. All the way through, he's talking about text and context, and he's saying that this is the way that Islamic legal jurists have approached these texts throughout history. So I think, there are two ways to approach this. There is the fundamentalist way of approaching the text and just go straight back to them and just read off what it says and say, well, the plain meaning of that is X, Y, Z, kill apostates or whatever. And I would say that that's pretty similar to what fundamentalist Christians do. They just go back to the text. In fact, in Christianity, there's even less chance for interpretation because you don't have centuries of legal interpretation like you do in Islam. So I think, contrary to what the narrative that you're putting forward, or the argument that you're putting forward, I think there's more scope within Islam for interpretation. I mean, just one of the things that, one of the interesting things that Tariq Ramadan says about the Qur'an is that when he analyses it, he tries to identify the key principles. So rather than looking at the specific things that they did back in the 7th century, he's always trying to identify the key principles, which, lo and behold, do line up with the kind of ethics that humanists would espouse.
But those are the key principles you're cherry picking, because what about the key principles of, I mean, you've read the Quran, right?
Yeah.
Every single page denigrates non-believers, like properly scornfully. I mean, this isn't just the oh, by the way, non-believers aren't very nice. It's literally every single page. And so, and to have to pray, make recitations 5 times a day, which will include I hate non-believers, God hates non-believers, they're all going to burn in hell, and it is my moral obligation to have jihad against blah blah blah. I think how difficult must that actually, on a pragmatic basis, be for Muslims to have a proper socially cohesive approach to a pluralist society? I couldn't believe reading it that it was so flagrant.
Okay, I agree it's a problem. I mean, a couple of things I would say about that is that my understanding is that millions of Muslim children across the world are brought up to recite the Quran, not understanding a word of what it actually says because they don't know Arabic. So the Quran itself is this kind of object, this kind of religious object, rather than necessarily informing directly what they believe.
But then they're not true Muslims, and they're not even understanding the Quran. I mean, that's kind of my point.
Okay, well, you keep coming back to this, not true Muslims, but I have a problem with framing it in that way. But
I think the problem will exist for as long as the Quran exists. I mean, the real basis of my point is that the text is actually not a nice text.
I agree.
And if you have that as your holy book, I think there are some fundamental issues that are going to be really difficult to get over. Because, especially if you have this basic idea that the Quran is the immutable word of God in some way. I mean, we can call it, there's some great, the problem is the great critical scholars that are around are few and far between, and they have to write under pseudonyms. So Luxembourg at the moment is a guy that's saying, well, actually a lot of these words are mistranslated Syriac words, and there's a lot of purchase in these ideas that actually the Quran isn't as solid as you think. That's great. However, you start doing that, it will crumble. So that's why these people are getting no purchase in the Islamic scholastic world, because you start accepting that, it falls apart very quickly. So if you want to retain that strong Muslim identity, then you need the Quran to be this brick which you can't chip away at.
But I mean, I think I would just say that centuries of legal tradition have not necessarily chipped away at it, but have interpreted it in different ways. Let me just make a couple more points about this, and then we will open it up, I think, to the floor. When I read the Qur'an, and you're quite right, all of these terrible things being said about unbelievers, it became very clear that what the Qur'an was talking about, and again, this doesn't make it much better, but it makes it a little bit better. The Qur'an was talking about wicked, evil people. It's not talking about kind of modern humanists. You know, we may be unbelievers in this room, but the Qur'an wasn't addressing ethical humanists. It's very clear from what it's saying that when it's talking about unbelievers, it's talking about wicked people. Okay, so when I realised that, I thought, well, this isn't actually addressing me as an atheist humanist, as an ethical humanist. So I didn't get quite the same reaction, or at least that, to me, that was some shield against what it was saying. So that's just one point. The other point is just going back to this idea of cherry picking. In one part of your talk you said, and not that this is your view, but the Qur'an is the immutable word of God, but in the other part of your talk you're saying about this principle of abrogation, so that the more ethical perhaps surahs from the Meccan period are abrogated from the more violent Medinan period. Well, how can the Qur'an abrogate itself? You know, that in itself is cherry picking.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'd kind of agree actually. I mean, the problems with the holy texts are, as an atheist, it's very easy to go, well, you've got a big problem there. The apologist, I think there are ways around that, and there's internal justification for abrogation within the Qur'an, and also the Hadith go into it even more explicitly. So it's kind of thought through, and it's coherent, at least to the Muslims themselves. You know, whether that stands up to a higher criticism from outside, I don't know. And you know, I think it's the whole idea of this God that comes down and says, or you know, doesn't come down himself, sends a messenger, and everything in the whole world is on God's command. So over and over in the Quran again, you know, nothing happens but without God's will, and that includes sin. You know, there's a lot of, so you know, you can actually pick apart the theology and the philosophy of it, saying actually it doesn't make a lot of sense on a lot of grounds. However, you know, that's easy for us to say because we can just like chuck it out. But for the Muslim, obviously they then have to do mental gymnastics to get around that. And yet, that's not to say there aren't those problems for them. There are clearly, I mean, I could go to town on all the kind of questions I ask to God and criticise about Christianity are equally applicable to the Muslim God, to Allah. So, you know, there are problems within the text for sure.
Okay, so you've heard Jonathan's presentation, my presentation. You see we're coming at this from slightly different angles. Not totally in disagreement, but there are some clear differences.
Arm wrestle.
But yeah, oh that's right, I forgot to say that at the end of the evening we're going to settle this by arm wrestling. So don't go before the end. Now, yeah, he's been look at those biceps. Right. Okay, Simon, have you got the, no, you haven't yet got, so David's going to give the microphone now. Okay, so the rules of engagement are you can't speak unless you have the microphone and just hold it steadily to your mouth. So John is first. John.
Oh, I don't, is it on? Hang on.
Hello? Yes, as I said, what an honour. It seems to me that you are almost, well, clearly the two of you are approaching it from different standpoints. Jonathan is talking about the text, and David is talking more about the history of Islam and the interpretation of the text. You're going back to the fundamentals of the text. Now, I mean, and David hasn't really, as far as I could see, challenged you on the actual wording of the text. So these different. Now, if you had to choose between those two approaches, I'd rather go along with David simply because it's a more hopeful interpretation.
I absolutely agree.
And if you look at the history of Islam and the interpretations of that history, I mean, there have been terrible things going on in Islam, the same as there have been in Christianity. In medieval times, probably Christianity was responsible for war, terrible atrocities like the action against the Cathars, for example, wiping out whole communities. But both of them did that. And I think David was quite right to point to the fact that there was a great period of Islam as far as learning and return to the sort of the wisdom of the knowledge of the Greeks and the Romans. We get largely through Islam. So, I mean, it just seems to me that if we're to, I'd like to come out of this in some sort of optimistic frame of mind and how we can move forward, rather than saying, well, Islam, if we simply say Islam is awful because the book's awful, then that seems to be, I'm not quite sure where we go from there. If we say, well, this is the history of Islam, and there have been periods in that we can hang on to and go back to, which and we can also, sorry, I'm going on a bit here, but we can also look in a sociological sense maybe at the as again I think you were, David, at the reasons why there's such extremism and such desperation, for example, in the Palestinians at the moment, and that's very easy to understand.
I think you can go through, you can put lots of things or try and encourage lots of things. So institutions of education actually really supporting critical exegesis or critical analysis of the Qur'an. So there's just not enough of it happening. So Islamic, 100% of Islamic scholars believe that Muhammad, the traditions, the Muhammadan traditions, pretty much 100% almost of Islamic scholars believe those traditions of the genesis of the Qur'an, right? That's not the same for Christianity. You've got atheists doing, Christian studies and theology. You've got a whole myriad of people. And so I think we need to encourage critical analysis. But at the end, you still are always going to have this issue that the Qur'an will sit there and be, even if it's just an excuse for a lot of unhinged people, it's a really easy excuse to do bad things because it's quite simply in the book, and Muhammad's actions were his actions. So you're always going to have an excuse for some extremists to fulfill, what they think is their destiny. So we can put loads of things in place, but the struggle, I don't think, will ever go away fully. And which is why you've seen it go like this. How many of those wonderful thinkers that David mentioned were done over as heretics? Sadly. Absolutely. But the great thing is that Christianity can just be cherry-picked to oblivion. And in a sense, Christianity now suffers because it's diluted. And Islam succeeds because it's purer in some kind of sense. How do we deal with that?
Yes, Estelle, if you can just take the microphone.
Yes, I agree with that, but I wonder sometimes it's not an individual thing. You've got the strong belief that it's hard for people that don't have huge consuming beliefs, and any change to it or any questioning brings about a fear. And I think it can be like a communal fear. They don't want it questioned, because once you start asking the questions, it like unravels, and the whole thing unravels, and for some people that feeling your life's gone or the world's gone, it's a huge thing. Whereas the people that can put the religion precious but to one side and live their life, they don't have that feeling. And the scary thing is, the fundamentalists are not afraid to die.
Is it alright then just answer?
Yeah,
sorry.
sure.
There's two really, really interesting points there. First of all, as an anecdote, I've got a friend, one of my best friends used to be a fundamentalist Christian, did a theology degree, and has done lots of philosophy, and has also just started a psychology master's. And I saw his Christianity unravelling. by how he could critically analyse it, and then that was the source of his unravelling. Not as a person, actually, he's become, flourished as a person. So that's really interesting. I absolutely agree with you. But there's something else to throw into the mix as well, and this goes for all religions. And it's something I don't know if anyone knows much about psychology of religion. It's something called terror management theory. Now, terror management theory is phenomenally interesting because it says that if someone, say you're a Christian creationist, right, and I'm presenting to you some evidence, rational evidence for evolution, what I'm actually doing to you is I'm presenting something which is threatening your immortality. And so therefore, when you are judging this evidence and you are considering the doubt of your own position, what you are doing is accepting that you will not live forever. So you cannot fairly judge that, and it's the biggest bribe to retaining a religious position. And unfortunately, as great as humanism is, and as correct I think as atheism is, it cannot offer that. We can't go up to people and say,
we're thinking of changing that, actually. So
just lie. Let's just atheism 2.0. Yeah, you live forever. Yeah, it's amazing.
I think that's a remark that a philosopher made, that philosophy does not provide a cushion for the soul.
No, that's a wonderful quote.
Okay.
We should just go, we've got 73 virgins, isn't that right?
Yeah, 73, just 73. And beautiful boys as well. Just one thing came to my mind then when you said that, Estelle. One of the hopeful things that oh dear, my mind's just gone blank. Who was the speaker that we had? Alam Shahar. Yeah. He said that most Muslims are Church of England Muslims. And I think you know what he means by that. Yeah, sort of wishy-washy kind of.
But that's exactly what I was saying. They're the sort of Muslims that put the societal moral values first, and Islam second.
Yeah, but that's a kind of hopeful sign. But
yes.
Yeah. Okay. Richard, and then at the back there.
Thank you. David, you wound up by saying something along the lines of humanists being able to become part of the solution instead of part of the problem.
Yeah.
Can you sort of repeat that sentence? Have you got it written down there, or do you remember exactly what you said?
Well, I can expand on what I mean by that. So
hang on, David, please. That's the point, really. It seemed to me, to be honest, a little bit of a platitude, and I wonder how on earth we might set about actually doing something like that.
So being part of the problem, I mean, I think, without being rude to Jonathan, I think Jonathan's stance here is part of the problem by saying this is the true Islam and it's terrible. I think part of the solution is for humanists to recognise that there are scholars, maybe few and far between, but there are scholars, there are thinkers within contemporary Islam and right the way back through Islamic history who are interpreting Islam in a more moderate, dare I say, humanistic way. And I don't minimise the problems that Jonathan has set out. They are definitely problems. But what I'm trying to do is say, well, look, there are lots of Islamic thinkers who don't think like that. And whether you think that their arguments are illogical or going away from true Islam or whatever, I think as humanists, those are the people we can encourage, we can build bridges with, we can say, that's there is a different side to this. I think if there's a real danger of everyone thinking Islam is terrible, Islam is Wahhabism, and this actually makes Muslim people more alienated from mainstream society, and that is a real problem, I think. So does that help a bit?
I get that. That's really interesting. So there is definitely a tension between this understanding that, so if I was to believe, which I do, that my points are true in some kind of way, then David is saying that the truth hurts, so let's kind of suppress the truth to a degree. So
I'm not saying that.
it seems a bit like that, but I kind of agree with that.
It's difficult.
That it is really difficult because, and I get that, and this is part of my own personal dilemma, is that I understand that what I'm saying is prickly and people don't like it, and it might, as you say, as a byproduct, accidentally alienate people. But on the other hand, you know, we can't, and I know we've got to do other things to stop that alienation, but you know, there's this tension between the truth being kind of suppressed or something, or being minimised, and I don't know whether that, in the long-term success of finding a progressive moral society, whether that will work. But I do get what you're saying, yeah.
Okay. Yes, just at the back there, yeah.
Hi, I think if I make it simple before I give some insights, it's very simple. Islam is the only religion that's still going out there to kill in the name of God. Christianity stopped, like this guy said, in the Middle Age, I don't see any other religion who go out there, send some people, and kill in the name of God. They are the only one who do it. Now, they are doing it according to a book, the Qur'an. As you said, it's reputable and it's dry, but I would say someone who studied it, there's most of it is preaching to kill, destroy, kill. Kill the one who don't believe, don't be friends of them, kill the town who doesn't do Islam, and so on and so on. So it's always kill and do and destroy. So that's why we see those extremists today, that they go out there and kill, because that's what there is in the Quran.
It's a very easy excuse for them, yeah.
Exactly. The same Quran that those good Muslims sitting and study and living accordingly to that book. Now, I can tell you in 2 minutes' time some insights that I've seen. I grew up with Muslims.
Briefly, please.
2 minutes. I grew up with Muslims. I speak the language. I know the culture. I study the Quran. Now, I saw in my own eyes things that not to do with terror. I'll tell you things in daily life. A woman who was abused by her husband is not allowed by law to go and complain. The court will not hurt her. Sorry. Secondly, a brother is proud to kill his sister because she went on a date. Now you will be shocked, but Google it and you will see. I come from the Middle East. I saw it in my own eyes.
I wanted to stay away from the hadith and some of the, but I absolutely get what you're saying, and there are issues with inequality, and there are issues with just pure. So there was, I must find it. I'm sure. I'd have to get research to find it. There was a really interesting ex-Muslim who wrote an article saying, if we swapped the words in the Quran, took a Quranic text, he said, if we swapped some of these words out and put atheist or something, or Christian in there, this would be seen as a hate text. It was really, really interesting. Yes. It was a very, very good article, and he basically just said, this is a hate text if you change these words from unbelievers to atheists or something like, or you know, change a couple of the key words so that you recontextualised it. And to me, that was really, really powerful. That was one moment where I sat back and thought, if I saw that, yes, I would say that that text was not acceptable for society these days. And I wouldn't want my child reading that. So, and I think that's a problem, as I wouldn't want them reading the Old Testament.
David.
Is that okay?
Yep.
I'd just like to have your views on the more current political situation and where it's going. You know, we've attacked Iraq, we've gone into Afghanistan, all Islamic countries, we've stood on the sidelines, perhaps justifiably, while things are happening in Syria, we've bombed Libya, we seem to have a penchant for depriving the Palestinians of their rights. How does this impact on people who follow the Islamic religion, and what do they think of us because of our actions or inactions? The other thing, I was probably as a sideline, be quite interested to see what the Chilcot report says about what the wise guy in the Foreign Office was saying to the government about, you know, the Islamic religion and what would happen in Iraq if what happened did happen, and we can see what has happened. You know, suddenly this ISIS appears. Blimey, where does it come from? I mean, it's a total failure of our system of monitoring. I'm just completely staggered by how it happened.
That's a massive question, David, you've opened up there. Jonathan, over to you.
World politics in 2 minutes. We buggered it up. But broadly speaking, we buggered it up, actually. So we kind of shot ourselves in the foot at quite a few opportunities. I think the amount of money we're pouring into war, you often hear this statement, and it's true, you know, they've got to sort out their own problems. So the problem is, how do we facilitate that? Because they're going to struggle with the Middle East is falling apart in infrastructure and this and that. You know, certainly from our own country's point of view, you know, who's it? Majid Nawaz and what's his organisation? Mind blank. Quilliam. So we want to put in billions of pounds into Quilliam. Literally, like, take the bombs out of here and all that money we're spending on that and whack that in Quilliam, because those kind of organisations will eventually secularise, or they're the best chance of secularising Islam, and that's what I would suggest we need to do. But that you need that around the world. It's really difficult because wrapped up in this, you've got oil, you've got money, you've got the Saudis, the Saudi royal families, or Wahhabism. You've got so many issues that are huge to unpick on their own. That we are getting to a stage where it's looking impossible to solve with anything like the next 10 years.
The academic from University of California, Khalid, in his book, he talks about a counter-jihad, you know, which is exactly what Jonathan was just saying, you know, pouring money into organisations like Quilliam, for example, which is countering Wahhabism, you know, and maybe that's one way forward. But
there's an interesting point, actually. Ibn Warwick, who's very interesting to listen to and read it. I'd like to read some of his books, I haven't yet. But he advocates, he states that we're just not strong enough in standing up for what we stand up for, right? So it's all about, you know, America against Islam, but what about having allegiance to rights and allegiance to world views and what we think are good and right moral frameworks? We need to be bloody robust and stand up and say, do you know what, this is good, and we are proud to fight, not militaristically, but to fight for those rights and for those good things that humanists certainly all stand for. We just need to be stronger in saying that thing.
Yes, Gary. It's on, Gary, just speaking to it, yeah.
Yeah, well, what Jonathan has just said, I mean, I think is absolutely right. I mean, I think that we're under attack. We're under attack from Islam, not just militant Islam, not just ISIS. I can give examples briefly. The Salman Rushdie affair. Salman Rushdie was protected by our security services for over 10 years because hundreds, maybe even thousands of Muslims went on the streets. They should have been arrested, advocating the death of Salman Rushdie, violating our laws, everything that we stand for, our tolerance, our laws, our freedom of speech. We're under attack all the time in France recently.
That was really interesting with Salman Rushdie because he was actually not defended by a lot of left liberals like myself. It was I only heard about this more recently because I can't really remember it that well because I'm so dashing and young, right? But it turns out that the people I look up to, you know, ended up being the liberal left that actually stood up for our economy, and it was this weird scenario that again you had like the right, the political right actually standing up for something.
Can I say something else?
Sorry, yeah.
When the Twin Towers was attacked and over 3,000 people were killed, among them of course Muslims, Jews, Christians, atheists, when that was attacked, the Muslims in the world applauded it.
Gary, I'm going to stop you there because we just need to be really careful that we don't say that, you know, a media image of some Muslims applauding that is the whole of Islam,
No, of
all
course not.
Muslims.
I'm not,
just need to be really careful.
I'm not saying that.
Okay.
I'm saying that there was vast support throughout the Muslim world. Not all Muslims upon us. The fact is that our security services, they're not looking at the Sikhs, they're not looking at the Hindus, they're not looking at the Jews in this country as being a threat. But the threat in this country comes from Islam. Whether we like it or whether we don't, we've got to defend the values, and I agree with Jonathan, we've got to defend the values that I uphold. The values that I live for democracy. I'll leave it at that. Okay?
Yeah.
That's
But
my opinion.
I just want to come back and say the threat is from Islamist extremism. Okay, I just think we need to be really careful about.
I'm not so sure I agree with that.
Okay, but that's what my position would be.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Okay.
It will take time to understand. It will take time to do work to understand.
Okay, Aaron, and then Dave.
Would it not be a good idea if the world, the Western world, whoever, could somehow encourage the Muslim population to have a figurehead like the Pope, who would probably speak for the majority of the Muslims on the moderate, nicer side, so that then there would be somebody to keep them in order in some way, or to advise them with some sort of leadership? I'm quite strange and astonished that they've gone leaderless for so long. Was there a leader at some point, or has this been a whole long time thing?
Never really had they've never had a papacy, an equivalent to the papacy. But in my presentation I was saying that the authority within Islam was in these law schools, which were quite prestigious, but with the end of the Ottoman Empire they sort of lost their funding and prestige. So the situation you've got now is that, well, kind of in a sense anyone can stand up, and anyone charismatic can stand up and say, well, I speak for the true Islam. So I think what you're suggesting, Aaron, is really interesting but quite difficult to achieve.
I love the idea. I've always loved the idea of a benign dictator. Right? Benign dictators are great because you can cut red tape. Just do it. Don't bother having a vote for it. It's great. You're amazing. However, they don't exist. But yeah, I generally agree that would be a nice thing, because I think there are aspects of the Islamic problem, if you like, that come out of the fact that there are no structures and it's it's like herding cats. You know, it's like trying to get humanists into sort of agree.
Yeah. Even we have a leader, Andrew Copson.
Okay, I certainly don't underestimate the problem we have with militant Islam. And I would say that Jonathan's done Islamic scholarship a great disservice tonight with his presentation of abrogation. I mean, that was almost ludicrous. Just that you take a verse, and if you find anything that seems to slightly contradict it, you just take the later one. That's not the way it happens. I've got a 25-page document here, which is on the science and interpretation of the Qur'an, and that's just a summary of all the different ways they interpret their texts, and they take the general principle to start with, and then they see why the later text might be different, whether it's a clarification. And I mean, there's been huge debates in Islam on the number of abrogated texts, and the numbers just go from an extreme of something like 7 to up to 245 at the limits. I mean, it's nowhere near this simplistic.
Absolutely,
it is really a cherry-picking exercise, because you can make it mean what you want by how you interpret it through this tafsir science.
Well, absolutely. I mean, we're all everyone's an individual, so at some point we're all interpreting everything. So there is always an interpretive layer to everything, because we're all subjective experiences. But yes, I've very much simplified application, because going through a 25-page thing in half an hour is not going to cut it. But it is important to mention that the Qur'an is not chronologically ordered. I don't know if everyone realises. So the Bible is pretty much chronological, and it has a lot of narrative. The Qur'an doesn't have a lot of narrative, and it picks at bits of the Old Testament. In fact, interestingly, it picks at Haggadic sort of midrash and the Talmud, these kind of commentaries. So it doesn't pick things from the Bible, it actually picks things from the Jewish commentaries, which, if you really get into it, it kind of pulls the rug out from the Qur'an itself again. So there are definitely critical analyses we can do which will pull apart the Qur'an. But application is interesting, because the Medinan parts of the Qur'an and the Meccan parts are not like, here's Mecca, which came first, and then here's Medina. They're just interwoven, and indeed, to find out which ones are which, you have to have the hadith to do that. And so it isn't as simple as clearly as I painted it, because actually, to understand the Qur'an, you do need really to understand hadith as well. And also, there are parts of the Qur'an which some people readily admit just don't make much sense.
The Qur'an admits that. It actually says some of it won't be able to be understood because only Allah understands it.
Yeah, and also the grammar that was used, sometimes it's called classical Arabic. It isn't even classical Arabic. It's there's just problems with. So there is wriggle room for sure, and there is lots to be. I mean, there is huge amounts of scholarly Islamic scholastic work going on. However, there's not a great amount of higher criticism. So if you look at the Bible, what happened in the 19th century is the German scholars had this movement called higher criticism, and they took the Bible to task, right? And that came from within Christianity itself. That's simply not happening with the Quran, and that is the challenge. That you will not get to a reformed Quran or reformed Islam until you can have a fair and open critical analysis of the Quran from Islamic scholars themselves. But Ibn Warwick was saying just recently, actually, that he knew, actually a few years ago, he was saying that he was asked what are the great liberal Islamic scholars that he knows. He said, there's some great ones, and they seem to be coming out of Kuwait at the moment. He named a couple. He said, unfortunately, the last one's gone into hiding and he wants political asylum. I don't know why, I've lost contact with him. And that's just the sad state of affairs. It's that the critical scholars that are out there are either working under pseudonyms, or they're just not getting the chance for their work to flourish. It was a massive challenge. Yeah. But yeah, sorry to have simplified that.
Yeah, I mean, the other point is that there have been huge debates and even wars over how the Quran is interpreted. It's not just a case of it's a very simple thing. I mean, even there's four main schools of Sunni Islam plus several of the Shia. They've all got different interpretations. Yeah. There is no simplistic one.
I'm not denying that. There's just less interpretative overlay than Christianity in the Bible. In comparative terms, the wriggle room is less. And that's seen just by there are less, although the camps are bigger, but then political camps actually. So Sunni and Shia is more to do with the caliphate that came afterwards than to do with the interpretation of the Quran itself. The point remains that those verses in there, which are pretty horrible verses, are in there no matter what your interpretation. They are denigrating non-believers. They are denigrating you and I. And there's no interpretation that gets around that. It is there.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to take all Muslims and just make them humanists, but that isn't going to happen. So we've got to find a moderate Islam first.
Yes.
I don't want to hold the mic all evening, so I'll make one other point, and I presume you're aware of the open letter to al-Baghdadi.
No, I'm not actually.
Well, it's quite easily available on the internet. A whole load of Muslim leaders have sent an open letter to al-Baghdadi, and it was in the papers as well. Al-Baghdadi is the leader of ISIS, for anyone that doesn't know who I'm talking about. And it's a hugely long letter, but the first part of it is 40 points of why al-Baghdadi has absolutely no clout to actually interpret the Quran whatsoever. They totally denounced him on 40 points of why he is not allowed to interpret the Quran. I mean, the first being simply that you have to know classical Arabic. That's, pre the diacritical marks and all the rest of it. And
well, straight away, there's your problem as a revelation from God. If God comes out, so the idea is that Arabic is God's language, right?
Yeah, I mean, it makes no sense.
I mean, from a humanistic point of view, you just unpick it so easily, right? As a revelation, I'm going to give a perfect revelation to the whole world that most people can't understand. Even the Muslims generally don't speak Arabic, and certainly that form of Arabic. As a revelation, it's pretty terrible.
Yeah, I mean, you don't reveal stuff in Syriac. You'd have taken Latin or Greek if you were going to be a sensible God and reveal in a language that was easily understood, written down.
Or just put ideas in people's heads,
Anyway, I'll shut up now.
Simon, just a brief point about that.
I was trying to learn something. When I studied the Quran over 6 or 7 years, I was trying really to study something, and I couldn't. I'm Jewish. I went to study Christianity, and I was fascinated by Jesus' philosophy. For example, turn the other cheek. That is something that I implement every day of my life. I learned many things when I read the New Testament, and I was totally objective. I was a student. I wanted to learn. I really didn't and couldn't understand anything from the Quran. I'm sorry. I'm telling you the truth. Not even one thing.
Okay, thank you. Ken, and then unless anyone is dying to say anything else. Oh, John, yeah. And then we'll try and wrap things up. Ken.
The Muslims have two problems. One is in the Quran. It keeps on saying any unbelievers must be killed. And the second thing is that in this modern world, the Muslims are underrepresented. I think they got no veto on the 5 nations have vetoes in the United Nations, and there's 15 members on the Security Council, and maybe, I'm not sure whether Qatar it rotates, but I think there's one small Muslim country that's represented there. But generally speaking, I would have thought that the Muslims are underrepresented in the United Nations, and if you're not represented, you can't make your point. You resort to violence.
That's a really interesting point.
Okay, John. Thank you, Ken.
Just quickly, I mean, when I worked in schools, some kids were always taken out of the building at lunchtime by their parents because their sect believed that they shouldn't break bread with heathens, so they were all taken away. Now that's a form of fundamentalism which is probably socially damaging to the kids, and you just think that's a bit odd. But the Islamic problem is one of many fundamentalisms, and I think we need to contextualise the problem with the question: what is it that, to our experience, a very modern world makes these peculiar fundamentalisms persist? And I think it's a universal question. It's about fundamentalist Christians in the southern United States, all sorts of extreme views. What causes those to persist? The other observation I'd like to make is that Islam as a faith, as it's manipulated by people in power, is peculiarly, as it was in its beginning, as you suggested, it was peculiarly benign towards extreme authoritarianism. And there are lots of non-democratic states which happen to have Islamic governments, and there's a symbiosis, there's a real sort of supportiveness of the two notions, that the religion and the form of the state and the government of the state support each other. They're anti-democratic, authoritarian things. And those two questions, I think, we need to think about in relation to the topics you've been discussing this evening.
That sounds as though you've given us an agenda for at least 2 more evenings on this, John, but thank you very much. Jonathan, I do want to...
Yeah, I do actually. 2 really interesting points. So the second one is about theocracy and whether Islam lends itself to theocracy, and that as a governmental mechanism is pretty dangerous, right? And it's actually linked to the first point, which is actually about morality, and really all we're talking about is morality. Because morality is should, any should question, any ought, right? Should we do this? Should Muslims be like this? Should they be morally progressive? So when it comes down to what is fundamental, I wrote a piece on this actually, what is fundamentalism? You know, what is extremism? And it really just looks like stuff that's vehemently opposed to our moral paradigm. And that's what's going on here. So really when we say fracture, but really in its simplest terms, this whole issue and the governmental issue is about morality. And that's why I said we've got to fight very hard for what we feel is morally right. But that means, because at the end of the day, there are some Quranic claims which are actually morally abhorrent. Like, it's not just like, oh, there's another religion saying silly things. You know, it's pragmatically, and on a day-to-day basis, in reality, it's pretty horrible. Some of the things that are condoned or advised in that book. And so this becomes a moral battle. And we've got to do some moral philosophy.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap things up there. And will you please give a massive round of applause to Jonathan? And a massive round of applause to me. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming this evening. For a long time I thought, you know, we really need to try and grasp this nettle. I'm really pleased that we've done it this evening, and I'm really pleased that Jonathan kind of instigated that or stimulated us to do that. I think it's an incredibly important subject. You know, we should have, you know, 100 people here this evening. I hope that you feel more informed about Islam as a result of coming tonight, and I hope that you'll continue to learn about it. Really important that we do. Just